All right, everybody. We're going to get started on our Locknote, final session of Black Hat Singapore 2017. Woo! Thanks for toughing it out. You should get a prize for being the last ones here, but sorry, no prizes for you. But we have beer. And we're going to use this beer to try to have an interesting conversation. The way the Locknotes work is I'm really trying to create an environment where we have these three experts having a conversation, talking about the things that interest them, the technologies, the challenges. And you're really sort of in the audience getting to listen in on what they're talking about, what's concerning to them. And then later on toward the end, about 2/3 in, maybe we'll open it up to the audience and then you can start asking them questions. But I really want it to be sort of a free flow conversation, not a panel, not sort of set pieces of conversation. And so all I have is I have about 4 or 5 topic areas, a couple of words, and that's sort of our starting point. And then we'll see what happens. And before I do that, I just want to thank everybody. So I talked at the opening keynote session that I think we grew about 20% in Singapore, and we were trying to figure out why and how. It turns out that we actually grew attendance total, business hall passes, trainers, trainings, 50% increase to about 1,800 people. And that's pretty huge.
Look at that. So
we're trying to figure out where everybody came from. And there was a lot of growth in Singapore, but also a lot of growth outside of Singapore. So it was quite a success. So of course, we're looking forward to seeing you next year. We'll be back. If we don't scare you away with what our 3 gentlemen have to say. So I'm going to just start it off. I have a word here, complexity. And you mentioned complexity was mentioned by Halvar in his keynote. Samil talked about complexity. In the last few years at Black Hat USA, I've talked about one of the only ways out of complexity I see is radical simplification. I don't really know how we would achieve that, but I'll do this exercise for the audience here. Who here in the audience thinks that in the future your environments will be more complex than they are today or less complex? Raise your hand if your world is only getting more complex. Right. Is anybody's world getting less complex?
Yeah,
right?
Wow.
I mean, so that's our environment, forever increasing complexity up and to the right. So what does that mean? Is there a natural bounds to complexity, or is it an ever-increasing state? Sort of like people specializing in jobs, right? In the early days, we were all farmers, and now we're micro-specialized. Where does this end, especially in our field? Go for it.
I don't know, entropy always increases.
Entropy always increases?
So basically at the end you need a big bang to reboot the universe and...
Or is it just all the machines eating us?
Well, complexity usually works in favor of the attacker. So at least I don't see us losing our jobs anytime soon.
Mm-hmm. Employment for life!
So the weirdness though is that I thought that, like I had this discussion with you and Ping a few days ago, that in 2001 I thought that security is going to be over in 5 years. And at the time I was contemplating whether I should actually go into security because I thought that it may not be a job with a lot of future. And I think all of us see complexity increasing, but we wish it weren't so. Because we all see that the complexity is outpacing our ability to deal with it. So I think when everybody raised their hands and said, well, complexity is increasing, this also means that it's not going to get easier to manage any of it.
Right, and so, I mean, I remember in the early days of hacking, you could have a Unix guy, a phone phreaking guy, maybe an exploiter, somebody that, and you could really have 4 or 5 guys. You could literally pretty much take over the world. Nowadays, my joke is you need 20 people just to understand the JavaScript. Right, and another 5 people to explain, you know, the DOM, and another 10 people in CSS just to render a page. And so we're hyper-specializing.
It's almost sad, right? Because there used to be a time where you could write the exploit and the implant yourself, and then actually do work. And every time I'm at one of these conferences, I go to different talks, and in every talk, I think, I wish I had more time to devote to this area. but you end up having to specialize in a fairly narrow field and just have a vague idea of the other things. But that's dangerous as well, right? Because the reality is the only person that gets paid to understand the system top to bottom is the attacker. Everybody else gets paid to understand his niche. So there's an inherent risk in only understanding your niche. But when everything is growing,
you don't have enough time, right?
Yeah.
So you have to pick something.
yeah.
Well, not even the attacker. I think there's been a couple of interesting examples in the past couple of years where you see that even on the attacker side, we're defending based on the kill chain in our corporate environments, let's say. And then the attackers have also specialized in certain levels of the kill chain. So you have a group that does the recon, a group that does the exploitation, the group for weaponization, the group that maintains the payloads, a group that does basically a enumeration of the network, then basically is just doing another kind of like drills on their own side. And then there's a group for exfiltration and data leakage and
Now, do they have like SLAs between them? Like,
yeah,
what are their
exactly.
user agreements?
Well, they're basically working like a company, right? And you have to have a specialized unit in every company. You have to have a CTO working on their side, maintaining the infrastructure, the payloads, the malware. You have a group that it's basically infecting and doing the account management, the money mules.
So essentially, and I like where you're going with this, right? It's no longer a vertically integrated crime group. The complexity has impacted their ability to be integrated. Now they have a supply chain of their own.
Exactly. They have the specialization fields as well.
Right. So does that force the criminals to essentially now operate like nation states?
They do operate more effectively. I think they've learned a lot from the nation states techniques, but I still think, and we've talked about it yesterday a bit, throughout crime, the thing that makes it very, and I like the word complexity of it because crime is always innovative. It's the first, organized crime is always the first one to put their hands on technology and try to wrap a business model around it, right? So cybercrime is not technically an IT problem, it's rather a business problem. The moment you disrupt the business model, you can make a big impact worldwide. Take ransomware, right?
Yeah.
Moving from a few millions a year in terms of global loss and damage, and now you're talking about $1 billion plus a year. That's because they've actually worked
They've
a lot.
optimized the business plan.
The business plan has become much, much more effective to make it, to reach out to a larger population, make
And
it
I
more
think
impactful.
we were talking about this, and it wasn't, like we were talking about early viruses, early viruses
Sorry.
that encrypted data. This guy Ludwig, right? He wrote the
Yeah.
big black book of computer viruses in like '95. And one of his viruses back then on DOS, it would encrypt your floppy disk or your hard drive, and then any other floppy drive you put in got encrypted, but it was with your password. And it was like a privacy virus that would keep your data encrypted. And we were like, what happens if we just change the password, right? Couldn't you ransom? And that was in '95, and we could never figure out why it was happening and why wasn't crypto locker style. And then we were talking, I think, yeah, we had the epiphany that it was the currency changes that made it possible, that made the business model possible.
Easier.
Right? It wasn't e-gold or Liberty Reserve. It was all too cumbersome and low volume. But Bitcoin solved all those problems, and
That's the boom.
caused the explosion, not that the technology or the business.
I would call it the catalyst. That was the catalyst that just came and changed. That was the game changer, right? 1989, first ransomware AIDS Trojan was a PO box in Panama that was basically collecting the money because you sent it in the mail. Then you saw in 2006 Archivist Trojan, another form of ransomware, which was go online, buy a fake online pharmacy, you get a 30-character digit code to unlock your machine. Revitin and the others were coupons and e-gold and PaySafe and whatever it is. And then 2013, Evgeny Bogachev comes up with the idea of having crypto locker with Bitcoin. And it's a proven business model, and everyone can do it. And every single entity you think, ransomware as a service, individual users, non-techie users, nation states, organized crime, everyone is in that game.
So this brings me to somehow we've now ended up on crypto locker. I love how these conversations go. Because Thomas happens to be a cryptographer.
I studied crypto 10 years ago.
So that means you've learned more, you've forgotten more than I will ever know in my life. Right? So so my question is, now these business plans are proven and they're generating revenue. So now they're going to take a percentage of that. They have to pay off their corrupt officials or whatever they have to do to bribe to keep their infrastructure going. But they're going to have a substantial profit. And that profit can be poured back in as research and development, R&D. So now you're talking about crime groups that had an R&D budget of $1 million, that next year might have an R&D budget of $200 million. So with $200 million a year, or $100 million, you can do probably some serious custom research, product development. And people make fun of some of the crypto mistakes. Like you can unlock it, or here's the mistakes here's a universal unlocking. But I think after a couple of years of a couple $1 million going into crypto, these crypto locker things are not going to be a joke anymore. You're not going to be able to unlock them, right? I mean, right now it's a specialized field. You studied it, but how hard is it for the criminal then to essentially not make mistakes in this field? And so we actually see ransomware and crypto locker stuff that it's like sort of professional grade. And in the old days, it was, well, that's the nation states and Intel community. Then it's academics. Then it's like Microsoft, Google. And it seems like the crypto knowledge is trickling down. Is there the trajectory on that also has these?
No, I mean, how many useful cryptographic messengers do you have? There's quite a few now. So it's not hard to encrypt data and send out a key to unlock stuff again. So it's very clear that we'll see stuff that we can't decrypt without the help of the guys.
Oh, they're doing it. So so the future holds that the only people that can unlock it in the future will be the people who locked it.
Yeah.
I think criminals are not worried much about the capability of locking. I think what they're looking for in terms of next innovation in that space would be first playing down on the psychology of the victim, right? So if you look at one of the latest variants, Spora ransomware, whenever you're infected, it gives you 5 options. One of them is you unlock 2 files for free. The other is you pay $20 to do a file restore. The other is an immunity for $50 and a $79 for all packages. Now,
don't delay. Order today.
Otherwise, prices go up. But the idea is that you end up feeling not as a victim, but rather as if you're buying a package.
You're
online,
a consumer,
right? You're a consumer.
Right.
So it feels okay. It doesn't feel like a crime anymore. The fact that it doesn't feel like a crime makes it become less reported to police, which already we have a massive problem with underreporting these type of crimes, and gives a much larger lifetime for the criminal operation.
Yeah, fascinating.
And that's psychology.
In a really harsh way, you can argue that fundamentally there's very little difference between getting your computer ransomware and then paying off the people that wrote the ransomware, or getting the computer infected and then paying somebody to disinfect it.
Correct.
Right? It's just the money flows to a different person.
Right.
But fundamentally, it's not all that different. And people are used to the model of paying to get the computer disinfected.
You want it to work, that's it.
So,
and if it's reasonably priced.
And this is something that's not new as well, right? 1900s, extortion was the black hand in the US, right? You had people coming in, mafia groups coming in, beating you and say, you need to pay, otherwise we're gonna blow you up. And then they said, too much violence, let's just go for a more soft approach, more crime, easy approach, below the radar, where police wouldn't be more alarmed to it, but people would accept it, have an acceptance of the crime, right?
So Bulgaria, after the wall came down, apparently had a car insurance that everybody had a sticker from that car insurance on their car, because the car insurance was mob owned, and if you didn't have the sticker, your car would get stolen.
There we go.
Right, so it's,
yeah, and I think this is really where the direction of it is overall going. And then you see the other part of it. I was reading that news a couple of days ago, and this is something that we're not very surprised because we said it's going to happen. Is we're going into micro ransomware, right? This is going to target a specific file, a specific application.
Microfinancing for micro ransomware.
Specific thing that you're so depending on that's going to make your life so difficult. So a friend of mine here runs a business in Southeast Asia, and what happened to him was a great story. They locked down his ERP system, so he couldn't use any of his, go and check his clients, do the whole day-to-day business online. And then we talked about it yesterday, so he was a victim of a ransomware. $39 variant, right? Stampede ransomware bot, very commoditized. The attacker tells them you need to pay 1 Bitcoin, goes into a chat, there's no online platform to go and submit it back again, and then he says, okay, 1 Bitcoin, my friend is not really tech savvy, he didn't ask anyone. The attacker says, I need remote access to your machine to basically unlock your data, right? Because I won't give you the master key. He goes in, unlocks it, and then steals all the files. So you're moving from a specific case where it's a ransomware into stealing data. So you're seeing the evolution of it is also becoming more like having a
So once the
foothold.
business model is in place for monetizing the stolen data,
diverge.
that's a new marketplace, right? So
You're diverging. I see it more like as part of a TTP rather than a total attack, a full attack.
Right.
I think they may run into issues with user trust, though, right? If you're normally when somebody pays you off, if you screw him over thereafter, then the next person ransoming him will have a hard time getting his ransom extracted.
yeah.
So,
But you know what's going to save us? AI.
Whatever, blockchains. Blockchains will save us.
Well, crypto quantum blockchain.
Quantum blockchains,
Yeah,
yes.
quantum blockchain.
Yes.
Machine learning, AI, where do you see this going? Because this is clearly out of my wheelhouse, but I'm really curious to see what you see. I mean, Google is one of the innovators. You've had some experience working at Google. I mean, and security at Google. I mean, do you see how they're trying to approach security is, I think ML and AI, I think algorithm. But supposedly when you incant these two words, a new superpower is formed.
Well, I mean, it is statistics.
Right.
And it's really good at recognizing cats.
It's true.
And it did kill captchas to a certain extent, right? Because a lot of the AI, it is not difficult to build an AI that is better than most humans are at decoding visual captchas these days, when it's just some sort of distorted form of lettering. And I think the difficulty of telling humans apart from bots is going to increase as AIs get better. Because if I was going to write a botnet now, I would definitely have a neural network in there to break captchas.
Yeah.
Just because it's really useful to be able to answer a captcha like a human.
Right. Well, I know there's whole product categories now of people with startups, and their whole product is using ML to identify synthetic, artificial humans and generated traffic, botnet traffic from real humans.
Content generation. Basically, blogs and content will just literally get spun out.
But then
the people who are writing it are no smarter than the damn machines anyway these days.
But then doesn't that mean the attacker does the same thing, trains on real human traffic, and now their synthetic traffic looks is just as indistinguishable as human traffic, and then that product category?
The only convincing thing is the synthetic traffic is free of grammatical mistakes today. That's how you catch it.
So I do think that attackers will smarten up, because a lot of the AI stuff at the moment is successful mainly because the attackers are not doing QA against it. Very few of the AI approaches are robust to adversarial input. That doesn't mean that they don't have a lot of utility. Like if you think about an antivirus signature and think about it in AI terms, an antivirus signature is just a classifier with a very poor generalization, meaning it doesn't match on new things very well. So for a lot of areas where we're using ad hoc heuristics at the moment, actually using properly configured statistical thresholds makes a lot of sense and is going to be better. Will the attackers adapt? I see a lot of awesome applications for AI from the attacker side. Think about phishing in human chats. Like as chatbots get better and get better at impersonating humans, people fall in love with like bad chatbots already. Right? So if you have an AI that can start chatting up 20,000 people in parallel, and start having like at least a fragment of a conversation enough to get them to click on something, you've just opened a whole new avenue for phishing.
Clickbait, for phishing. And a whole number of things that.
And the nice thing is you have a really direct feedback loop where you can see whether your algorithm is improving or not by the number of people clicking.
Yeah, you monitor the responses, and you can even play one person off against another.
That's right. Yeah, you're in two different chat groups.
Yeah.
You're a man-in-the-middle chatbot, but.
Can do. Not inconceivable.
Yeah, so that's why when I hear these pitches about how ML and AI is going to make change, defense will become greater than offense, or defense will have a chance of increasing, I think maybe momentarily, because there's no law that says offense can't use these tools. Like
offense will always adapt it before defense does. There's new
but don't
areas
you
to be
think
broken.
offense is winning so hard? Why go to AI when you're making such great returns? I think only once.
Well, why not? Right? Is the question. Because you can do it. The moment something new happens, what do guys do? Like, we'll tear it apart. We'll like just for the curiosity of it.
Right.
And then
but
somebody
if ransomware is working, why change the model until the model stops working?
To maximize the profit.
You still need to get people, usually, like a lot of the ransomware still needs human interaction in order to be installed. And that's something where, the ransomware people need to use the same techniques as the ad targeting people, right? You want to pick the person that is most likely to click on it and provide him with the thing that he's most likely to click on. So ranking search results and giving people the right ads and giving them the right ransomware is going to be, it's the same problem in the end, right?
It's the most comfortable ransomware. It really fits your mood.
I think it's more a question as well of looking at it from the criminal side. It's more about breaking ML and AI, right? There's a lot of effort being put by attackers to basically put a lot of techniques up front and test them to evade machine learning technologies or.
Well, I want to move on to the next subject, but not to beat it too deeply into the ground, but the metrics for offense are pretty, you got in or you didn't. It's a measurable, you can have a threshold, you can determine when you've gotten in. For defense, it's not.
Yeah.
So it seems like the ability to detect that you've hit your metric for a feedback loop is really important. So I think you can train these models on the offense side probably much faster than on the defense side.
I guess as long as we have infrastructure where the attacker can deny the defender the knowledge whether it has worked what he did,
right,
we will have an attacker that has a tighter feedback loop and that can adapt more quickly.
Drink, because that's not a good future.
It depends. Do we expect to be here in 20 years?
I'll have nanobots in my bloodstream by then, keeping me alive. Also came up a lot was this talk around sort of social dilemmas, and we're reaching these technical problems where there's no clear technical solution, or there's a competing mess of technical solutions, but not enough will. And so now we're talking about policy and insurance. And in the policy debate world that I sometimes inhabit, you see two things going on. One, tech people tell the governments, don't mess with us. We're the engines of innovation. We're creating the jobs. If you mess with us, everybody's going to be unemployed. And so the policy people are frightened of that argument and generally stay away. But on the other hand, these policy people have studied history and they like to think of themselves as trying to make society a better place. And there are certain sort of tragedy of the commons problems where there's clearly no one in charge. Everybody's using a shared resource, but nobody's in charge of the resource. And that is a classic government policy problem. That's when government generally steps in to provide some sort of guidance when the market is failing. So I'm thinking and a lot of your talk was in these areas where they're starting to look really ripe for government intervention because the market's failing or the insurance isn't working. And so I'm curious from your perspectives, I don't want policy intervention. I would like the tech community to self-regulate. But it seems like that's not happening, and it's never happened. So just like complexity ever increasing, I'd like to see a show of hands. Do you think our industry will be able to ever self-regulate to avoid policy regulation? Raise your hand. Do you think we're going to have to see governments intervene because we have these market failures? Yeah. Okay, so if that's our future, I'm just thinking, how do we let that not totally destroy our livelihood? What do you make of that, I guess?
So I think there's going to be a bigger clash because in many areas of the world, perhaps not so much in the US, but in many other areas, you see a clash of sovereignty with the new reality of what our digital world looks like. Because most of the internet giants sit in the US. China has internet giants because they've walled themselves off. Russia has internet giants through other accidents. But there's large parts of the world where the individual country has very little sovereignty in the sense of very little power.
Zero giants.
Let's imagine somebody like the Netherlands getting into a tiff with Google. Or let's not take Google for a moment. Getting into a tiff with another internet giant and deciding that they want to sanction them in some way and lock them out. For quite a few of the internet giants, the people would be rebelling in the street against their own government if they can't access Facebook, for example.
They need their cat.
So you have a clash of sovereignty in the sense that a lot of the smaller players do not actually have a lot of influence over the digital giants. So any government intervention is going to be complicated by this.
The asymmetry of data is where the power is. So the more the data you have, the more power you can exert as an organization, even upon another nation. I mean, literally, and what actually concerns me is what are the policies around these new digital nations that are emerging? Because we clearly have the giants like the Googles and the Amazons and the Facebooks who are virtually nations with pretty much,
Their own
not a very,
worldview.
not a
Yeah.
very democratically led government, so as to say, if you view them as nations.
Right.
It is a,
But you've opted in, so that's your vote.
that's right, so we as citizens. Right, exactly. So, but yeah, that asymmetry angle does kick in, and it's easy to muscle populations out too.
Yeah.
There's no choice.
I'm going to add a few points on these and more from a law enforcement perspective. I used to work for law enforcement, so it's going to come in my angle a bit different on that. It was worrying a few years back seeing how countries would be able to interact with these tech giants, right? A request that comes in for a person that may have been hacked by a boyfriend and girlfriend has to go to Facebook from France, right? So that would take around 6 weeks if you send an MLAT that is effective to get a reply on that. But a kid that is kidnapped in Gabon, in Africa, takes up to 3.5 years to get a reply on that, right? There's still a lot of imbalance also at that level to explain to these tech companies that interacting with the governments and the countries has to be done at its kind of like equilibrium at an equal level with a certain validation of understanding there's certain risks in the world that need to be considered
Like you have
above all of those
you have
policies.
a social responsibility.
Yeah, above all of those policies and regulations and all this fighting, all this politics, there needs to be a certain layer of working and interoperability between governments, and between countries, and between tech giants so that there could be good done in this world. And for the time being, a lot of these things are being hampered, being stopped. And this is happening on a daily basis, maybe not hitting the newspapers every day, but it has a big impact on the world.
But this imbalance that you mentioned, that goes back to the point that Gabon has very little leverage to get anything done.
Right.
Exactly.
I mean, I think a lot of if you look at the European Data Protection Act and what that does to cloud providers, where the Europeans say, hey, you can't be sending all this data to the US, that is actually a conflict between Google or the internet giants as the big players, and then the US as a sovereign where these are hosted, saying that we want access to the data of non-US citizens, and then the other side trying to enforce sovereignty, but because they have no other lever, they try to hurt the commercial interests of the big
that's
ones.
like their proxy. For
Yeah, right. But in all these conflicts, you can see the clash between nations trying to, or smaller nations trying to keep sovereignty of sorts in the face of the internet giants becoming providers of essential services. I mean, by now, having an email account is about as important as having, well, not as important as having tap water, but it's getting to be relatively important.
Like having a driver's license.
Right,
almost,
but now you've
yeah.
got commercial entities under the sovereignty of another nation that provide critical services to your populace
Right.
that other nation could switch off at a moment's notice. And that is, in a way, undermining the traditional concepts of sovereignty.
Yes.
So, sovereignty of countries over, let's not say internet giants, but over manufacturers, builders of devices, phones, Samsung, iPhone, whatever it is. Something I've always been fascinated about is that we spend how much time, how many hundreds of millions, billions of dollars trying to protect devices, and it seems like the root cause is if the problem is Android has terrible update policy, well, if you say Android fixes that, then we don't have to have all these security products around Android. We fixed it right at the source, right? Those closest to the levers should be the ones responsible for fixing the problems. The person 3 hops away shouldn't be trying to fix the problem. The person closest to the issue. So if it's a Cisco bug, Cisco should fix it, and we shouldn't have a whole industry of Cisco protection products. So when I look at the world through that lens, I think there's probably 20 manufacturers on the planet that if they made better products would probably solve 60, 70% of a lot of our issues. CPE devices that don't filter, that are part of botnets, IoT devices. And it goes back to sort of your cost and leverage of your keynote, where I've talked to senior vice presidents at these product companies, and I say, your product marketing is that you're a world leader in security. All of your products are insecure by default. I have to click a whole bunch of boxes and write custom firewall rules to make your product secure. Can you make the product secure by default? And then if I'm an expert, I can say, okay, I'll make it insecure. And the answer from the world leader in security, the head of the engineering department says, Our customers have never asked for that. I'm thinking, but why are you waiting for a customer to ask for it? You are the innovator, you are the leader. And I'm thinking, to your point, how do we're complaining about problems and we're so far removed from the people best positioned to fix them.
So perhaps we need a Henry Ford of security who, I mean, Ford famously said, if I had listened to my customers, we would have a faster horse.
Yeah.
Right? So perhaps to a certain extent you need somebody that just implements things even though the customers are not explicitly asking for it.
Sure.
And you could argue that if you look at the efforts that Apple has undertaken to make persistence on iDevices hard, most likely their customers weren't asking for this either, but there's somebody that actually drove this.
Right. Some internal culture, something. But it wasn't an external request.
Well, I think there's a culture of actually somebody having an idea, like having a clue about security and then thinking, hey, we can go here, and then going here. But if you're just trying to do incremental improvements around what customers currently ask.
And actually that's made a priority.
Yeah.
So protecting the user is a priority on the iDevices, and any effort to be made in that direction is welcomed as an organizational culture. That's what's driving it. I mean, the Android thing, Jeff, is back to being fragmentation, right? Windows 95, Windows NT, we have a plethora of manufacturers building devices and drivers, and it's basically the third-party code that gets introduced in a framework that causes all the bugs. Same thing with Android. You have models, you have different
Right.
phones, different drivers, everything gets mixed up. And then it is that third-party stuff that breaks. You do not, as a manufacturer, have complete control over what gets sent to the customer.
So as not only as hackers, but as security professionals, so what is the fix besides, if you can't influence the people who are making the products, we're forever stuck in this world of Band-Aids? Just like we're stuck in this forever more complex world, are we also in the world of Band-Aids? I'm okay with it, I just need to know what world I'm living in
So
so I can
I guess
properly medicate myself.
I guess I would agree that if you don't fix the incentive structures, like the incentive structures are at the heart of everything that happens.
Yeah.
Like people will do what will get them promoted, people will do what will give them more money, and unless you fix the incentive structures, you won't have persistent change.
Right.
Like everything will be washed away.
And since we're not seeing any, I'm not seeing any, the only thing I see that could potentially be an external forcing function on incentive structures is policy. And I don't see a lot of appetite there. So that means probably not.
Yeah, I think yet, right? Because if you look at IoT business, for example, fines are probably the closest thing that we could see if manufacturers are not doing their job, right? I mean, seeing another bunch of DVRs and CCTV cameras operating, just wildly like that on the internet without the basic protection, or even when it comes to the guidelines, you have to set up your own password and all your own credentials to it. But just having these devices, and some of them do not have this capability, deregulation at the end has to come and find these manufacturers and say, this is not a product that's acceptable to go out in the market because it's causing a big issue overall, right? And there's a minimum standard needs to be agreed on in the industry to release these kind of products.
But the takeaway,
I have an example for this. Remember the Wi-Fi Alliance, the logo, the one that says WI and then an FI?
Yeah.
Stuff that came out in the late 90s. We had Orinoco and Lucent and Aeronet cards back then, the PCMCI cards. And initially when Wi-Fi 802.11-ish networking came out, manufacturers tried to deviate from the standard and build something proprietary and then sell their own routers with it. Quickly, the IEEE and the Wi-Fi Alliance stepped in with a branding and made it consumer aware that if you want to buy a Wi-Fi router or Wi-Fi device, look for that Wi-Fi logo, otherwise it is not compatible. And they kind of drove this problem away simply by consumer education and branding it.
Not entirely though, because any router these days is going to implement Cisco proprietary extensions to the Wi-Fi protocols that you can't even get the specs for unless you sign an NDA with Cisco, which then surprisingly have.
So it comes back, right? Every 11 years, Death Star becomes Star Killer Base. The same shit keeps on coming back. And that's why we are here from 99 to 2017 at Black Hat. Sorry,
looks back to the incentive structure.
Yeah.
What may actually shift the incentives as well is innovative cybercrime that causes real damage.
Right.
Like the first time we're ransomwaring the power supply for a city, which will happen eventually. Because, I mean, techniques filter down to the criminal side eventually. What is nation state level now is going to be criminal level soon.
And accidents happen.
And accidents happen. And then, I mean, the logical extension of ransomware, if IoT is all crap and everywhere, people will start ransoming your IoT devices.
And then your water supply.
And then it's going to be really, really entertaining.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's an interesting point. As the trickle-down effects, right, happen, imagine if Sony, when Sony Pictures was under attack, imagine if Sony went out of business and, I don't know, 1,500 employees are out of jobs. And then some newspaper somewhere criticizes some country and the country DDoSes them, and the newspaper can't do their online publishing. The newspaper's out of jobs and 500 people are out of jobs. And then 1,000 people and 3,000 people. And how long until you think the government is going to say, okay, well, we can't have our citizens unemployed. We can't have our businesses being put out of business. We're going to do something. And then the government's going to have to act. And that's what I think is going to be the danger point. Because in that situation, the government can't be passive. They have to do something. And we're back into a potential 9/11 situation where we're doing something, you know, anything is better than nothing.
So that brings up the attribution problem. Like, who is it that really did it? Are you really attacking the right attacker?
But even if you're not attacking the attacker, you're going to come up with a policy. You're going to say it's the ISP is the closest, the backbone provider, and what I'm thinking is, unless we can come up with viable alternatives or think this through, our time is going to run out the first time the power plant is ransomed, the first time 10,000 people lose their jobs, voters lose their jobs, then that's when the clock is we're really under pressure. I think we're on borrowed time now. Correct me if you're wrong on that.
I think one of the main challenges you just mentioned right now is how are we going to get the attribution right so that we can worry about that, right? Eventually...
But you don't necessarily have to worry about it, right? If you've got a manufacturer that sold you a product that's...
No, power plants have been already held on ransom, right? And water stations and all of that. But who was it pinned on?
But I don't think we have proper attribution for terrorist attacks these days unless the terrorists actually write a letter. And
No.
I don't expect to get proper attribution for cyber attacks.
But I do expect countries that are victims of cyber attacks to point it out to other institutions and countries and factions that may not be behind the attack to pull leverage at a political level.
Right.
And this
I mean,
is
it'll be
something-
obvious because there'll be 1,000 people unemployed.
Yeah. And it was interesting because the other day I was talking to some cyber insurance companies, and then they came and they said, going through the policies, and I asked a couple of questions. So destructive malware is not part of the coverage, for example. Shamoon attacks or any kind of thing doesn't fall under the coverage they have. And I asked, okay, what if the institution the corporation is under attack from a nation state? Said, yeah, well, we will not be covering it, and it's on you to prove that it's actually a nation state, right? Which is completely ridiculous. You'll probably never be able to do that, but you might see that being leveraged at a higher level in bigger attacks where people might die, and say it's not our fault because we failed this and that. It's because someone in that country who actually isn't behind it, or faction isn't behind it, is beyond it. And you create more of a tension level, and it goes at a higher level of negotiations, politics, policy, all of it. And this is what's going to cause more tension in cyberspace.
You're mentioning something interesting, like the fact that an attack may be perpetuated by a nation-state-like actor, which is not actually a nation-state. If you look at what Russia is allegedly or doing, perhaps, or what Russia is accused of doing in Ukraine, where they have people that seem to be very plausibly from the Russian government running around in Ukraine, and, oh, these are not our people. The question of attribution becomes really difficult because when you have a government that is hosting or just not enforcing the law selectively against a particular group, is this now a government attack or is it not?
Right.
And yeah.
They have proprietary groups operating outside of the country. I mean, North Korea is always accused of having proprietary groups in South Korea, Malaysia, I think it was just mentioned. And so they're proxy groups.
Well, operating on behalf of the nation state.
At direction,
as
maybe
organized
independently
crime
funded, but they're really...
I have a question about cyber insurance. Is there any documented stuff where a company has actually collected money from a cyber insurer?
Cyber insurance
Yes.
have paid for ransomware payments and so forth.
Ransomware.
What
else? I want like
cost of cleaning up.
Okay.
Well, in some cases, mainly in the banking,
Breach
mainly for
or,
breaches or
breaches
credit
and
cards. Ransomware, for example, and negotiation extortion is being covered with some companies.
Yeah.
I usually point out that ransomware, for example, is useless with banks because if a bank pays a ransom, you're paying money for an anonymous entity, a criminal entity, so that's actually breaching your own anti-money laundering laws, right? So you'll get a regulator coming in and fining you even more than the ransom itself, right? So it kind of so criminals don't attack banks. Ransomware is useless, but this is something. It's from cyber insurance level. It's very tricky because some companies are buying multiple different insurances to cover different aspects of it. Right? And on that point as well, forget that. You see more cyber criminals throughout 2016 have become more media savvy, right? So I'm not getting what I want from the extortion attempt from the company, so I go to the media, and journalists love to talk to the media and talk to attackers, and they give them airtime, they give them a small article, and they say, great case in Liechtenstein, the bank said, the attacker said, we tried to reason with the CEO, he never paid, we just asked for some money, a little bit of money. So now, for the victims, we need 10%, and then we're basically not releasing your personal records and information and your transactions. But it's not our fault. It's the CEO of the bank that didn't help you. And they're actually very upset because he's supposed to be in their eyes, maintaining their business and their accounts. So again, playing on the psychology of the whole thing and using media to put more pressure in these. And cyber insurances are not covering these things as well.
So we're in the final stages here, and I have another word on my notes, and it's this concept of no passwords. Remember how we're supposed to be in the passwordless future here.
So I would argue that having a password in addition to other factors is still useful in the sense that having a shared secret is a form of authentication and it's useful.
But how about
relying entirely on like a password? A password is a bearer token in the sense like a bearer share, meaning whoever has the password can authenticate. Whoever has the bearer share is the owner of the company. And relying on transmittable, easily transmittable things that can be duplicated without realizing as the sole means of authentication is horrifyingly bad. Don't do it.
So the concept of these, the U2F, YubiKeys, SSH identity, password managers, biometrics, do you see a viable future, or are we going to have passwords forever?
So I think that even with the two-factor authentication, you have two factors. You have the password, and then you have the physical device. And I don't see it to be very helpful to have the password go entirely away.
It just seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like there's a lobby forming, and I'm not sure who or what's behind it, but there seems to be this meme of it's now time to do away with the password. And I don't understand where it's coming from or who's behind it, or somebody must be making money from it, but I don't understand it.
So doing away with the password alone, that's something I will immediately sign. Like passwords, like a duplicatable secret that can be duplicated without me knowing and then used to impersonate me.
Right.
That's a really bad idea.
But I might need to duplicate the secret to put in the envelope, so if I get hit by the bus, my wife can log in.
Yeah.
So there's some value here, right?
But that can be done with a different mechanism, though. Sort of like a power of attorney, not necessarily
make
your
duplicate
password.
YubiKeys?
Or have like paired devices only can be used when you like join two known entities together and unlock it. Something of the sort. It doesn't mean
imagine
like
if
matching keys.
Imagine if you get hit by a bus, but your wife has your master password to your one password thing. Okay, she can get in and manage your life and figure things out. But if I have to, every time I change a password or do something, I have to like regenerate 20 YubiKeys and put them on a keychain and mail them to my attorney. I'm just wondering, who is this benefiting, this concept?
But why would you have to regenerate the YubiKeys when you change your password?
No, I need to make duplicate keys for my wife if so let's say I see what you're saying, right? The very first time you create your identity certificate, if you can back that up or you can load that into a duplicate hardware device, But if you lose the device, now you want to get another,
right, I mean,
you got to regenerate,
I think the other solution that came out is still very shaky, and biometrics is still something that's pretty much being reviewed. But the rate of uncertainty with it is really high. The problem for repudiation is massive. Right?
Yeah, and
You're not gonna, I mean, you lose a password, you just reset it. You will not chop off your finger.
Right.
It's something that you can't deal with. And from, for example, text DNA and text mining technologies, we're using it as biometrics for authentication is not really proven so far. I don't see the password going anyway. And
You don't see it going away?
I don't see it going away.
You
I see
see-
so I see the combination of
Certificate.
a password with a physical token where you have to demonstrate by touching it or whatever that you're physically present in front of your computer.
Yeah.
I see that as a viable authentication mechanism.
Yeah,
YubiKey.
Yeah,
same.
thing, yeah. They're going to stay.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, again, to the late 90s, where we had the race for PKI. It was going
Right.
to be the panacea that is going to solve all the problems because everything's on a smart card. My driver's license has a smart card. Damn thing doesn't work. Does the smart card, not the license, though. But the thing is, we had 3 different manufacturers and 3 different formats, Gemplu, Schlumberger, and I think Utemeco. And they never agreed upon these standards. So in failure of standards being agreed upon, you fall back to the lowest common denominator, that is the password.
Right. Yeah, fascinating. Okay, so let's see. Forever raising complexity, minimum government regulation, passwords. Doesn't this sound like 2001 again?
Sure.
So with that, let's thank everybody for the panel. Thank you for
Thank you.
Black Hat. And we'll see you next year. Thank you.